On one occasion, Ethel convinced Bobby to have a midwinter cookout in the Attorney General's office, using the fireplace to grill hamburgers and hot dogs. When Bill Gogian, an assistant attorney general, questioned the decorum and suggested that pre-cooked chicken might be more appropriate, Bobby wrote him a memo. "You're getting old and crotchety. We will not get to the moon first with this attitude." I do not think that cooking hamburgers and hot dogs in the fireplace is how you get to the moon, but okay, Bobby. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Denise. We're going to keep going in The Other Mrs. Kennedy, and we are starting out on part 8. It's called Attorney General's Wife. Thank you guys so much for your patience yesterday with that sad, pitiful 10-minute episode. That was unfortunate in the extreme, but we've got a long episode today. So, sit tight. I'm going to read for an hour, and I don't know where that's going to get us, but I'm going to tell you one place we're going to go, and that's to Crazy Town. So buckle up, because, you know, now that Ethel is getting a little bit of power, she's like her mother. Her mom went crazy when she got money, because to her mom, money translated as power. Well, Ethel's always had money, so she doesn't need money to make herself feel important or puffed up. But now she has political power in her husband, and we're just going to see her use and abuse that power. And she's becoming very arrogant and full of herself. And that's going to become more and more evident as this part goes on, but I'm just going to let you know that's where things are going. Because quite frankly, up until this point, I haven't really disliked Ethel. I've just kind of felt like she was sort of a bit of an airhead. Didn't really seem like she had a lot of thoughts of her own. I can sometimes see why she took the stance that she took on various things, because she seemed like she was in a bit of a controlling marriage. But she just didn't seem like a serious person. Not somebody who would be worthy of my disdain. She just simply wasn't a serious enough person for me to dislike. Her silliness was just silliness to me. But now I feel like the way she's going to begin to treat people is fairly unacceptable. And it's just going to become more and more pronounced as she gets older, and as she uses her power, and as she begins to become more and more visually arrogant. She may have been arrogant before, but I just don't really feel like it was just coming off as distasteful as it will begin to appear in these coming chapters. But anyway, enough of my chit-chatting. Let's get to it, because I'm sure I'll have plenty to say as we're reading. Okay, this chapter is called A Sexy Inauguration. So you recall that Jack has become president, his brother is now the attorney general, and the family is living high off the hog. The book says, on January 13th, 1961, with Ethel and Jean Kennedy Smith watching attentively, Bobby appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee. It was expected that the Republicans on the panel would give the Attorney General designate a tough time over the nepotism issue. But the only criticism came from Everett Dirksen, the floor leader, and Nebraska's Roman Hruska, both of whom questioned Bobby's relatively brief legal experience. Hruska wanted Bobby to explain how effective he thought he could be, since he had never tried a suit, chosen a jury, written a trial brief, or negotiated a settlement. That seems like a substantial question. You know, I mean, it doesn't seem like he's just picking holes apart in Bobby, but how are you going to be the Attorney General if you've never done any of those things? Well, his pithy response was that, I can't make up for the fact that I have only had 10 years out from school, Bobby stated. But I think that what I have done, or what experience I have had in those 10 years, will be of tremendous help and make a tremendous difference in this new position. Okay. Well, questions also were raised about Bobby's finances and whether any of his holdings would conflict with his job. He disclosed that he had sold his stock to conform with the conflict of interest laws. Now, he said, he owed only government and municipal bonds and cash. He also acknowledged receiving about $100,000 annually after taxes as a beneficiary of two major irrevocable trusts set up in 1926 and 1936 for him and each of his brothers and sisters by Joe and Rose Kennedy. Bobby's answer seemed to satisfy everyone. After just 2 hours of gentle probing and lots of praise of his character and ability, all 14 committee members voted to approve the nomination. At 35, Bobby became the third youngest attorney general in history, and the only one whose brother was the president. A week later, at a luncheon, Jack Kennedy said jokingly, "Well, I don't see anything wrong with getting Bobby a little legal experience as attorney general before he goes out to practice law." Oh, Jack, what a knee slapper. Well, of course, Ethel sees this as a tremendous opportunity to go shopping, and she decided that she was going to go in search of, quote, a historic old desk for her husband's new office. She eventually found a 6-foot square mahogany desk used by Amos T. Ackerman, the first Attorney General to head the Justice Department when it was created in 1870. Inauguration Day, January 20th, 1961, was bitterly cold in the nation's capital. More than 6 inches of snow had blanketed the city the night before, delaying by 2 hours the star-studded Democratic fundraising party arranged by Frank Sinatra and Peter Lawford. Because of the storm, Ethel had stayed with Kennedy family members in Georgetown to avoid being snowed in at Hickory Hill. Ethel was almost as anxious as Jack that morning. Her inaugural dress and beaded gowns for the 5 inaugural balls were in the trunk of her dressmaker's car, which was buried under a mound of snow. Luckily, no water had seeped in, and the wardrobe was delivered in pristine condition. Despite the fact that the Skakels were dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, none of them was able to resist a good party, even if it was a Democratic bash. Since Jack's inauguration promised to be a humdinger, Ethel's siblings put aside their political differences and across-the-board animus toward the Kennedys, and blithely accepted invitations to attend all of the inaugural events. One gossip columnist reported that the pretty wife of Robert Kennedy wangled the invitations, but she issued a warning: none of the gals must wear Nixon earrings. Georgie Ann, making one of her rare ventures out of Sursum Corda, came to Washington by train, fearful of flying. Also down for the week were Anne and John McCooey. George Jr. and Pat Skakel showed up, as well as Ethel's brothers Jim and Rushton, with their wives. But Bobby, who despised them all, wouldn't allow the Skakels to stay at Hickory Hill, so Ethel had to make other arrangements. Let's just stop right here. We cannot underestimate the pressure on Ethel that her husband does not like her family. She's got a lot of siblings, and he doesn't like any of them. So to constantly have to keep her relationship with her family to be this like side personal thing that she has, and she can't ever let them into her house and she can't ever have them over, would be such a bone of contention. Even if she didn't make a big deal about it, even if it was just this thing that was between them where she knew that he didn't like her family, so she tried not to make a big thing of it, you would always feel this sense of nervousness every time one of them wanted to stop by or they were in town, you had to see them. Always trying to arrange your life around your husband's dislike for your large family. It would just be very hard. And I know a lot of people said, oh, Ethel was terrible because she cut her family out. And I think that she got a lot of grief for it. But I also think that for her, in order to maintain her marriage, she had to choose him over her siblings. And while I think there is some precedent for once you get married, like, this is your new family now. You know, it's not you constantly going back to, you know, your siblings and your parents and feeding into that relationship while you sort of abandon the family and the marriage that you're in. But I don't think that that's what we're discussing here. I think what we're discussing is a very controlling husband who would not allow his wife to cultivate a relationship with her siblings. I don't think we're talking about a healthy situation in which she wanted to pour most of her love and affection and time and effort into her now new immediate family. Anyway, Bobby, you know, I think that Robert Kennedy has always gotten a great reputation because of his more kindliness, and he seems like he was a good father, more so than some of the other Kennedys. And I think that because of his stance on civil rights and his public leanings, and his public reputation towards generosity and towards unity and fairness, I think that I always assumed that he was a person whose personal relationships would have benefited from that seemingly generous spirit in all of the things that he was politically interested in. But this relationship that he has with Ethel is very, very, very controlling. And it really undermines all of the things that he seems to have so publicly cared about. Anyway, I've prattled on long enough. Back to the inauguration. The George Skakel Jr.'s, whom Bobby resented the most, he had never forgotten the Dave Beck party incident in Greenwich, stayed with Sarah and Spencer Davis in the Tony Spring Valley section of Washington. Ethel adored George, but it was hard for her because he wasn't Bobby's cup of tea, Davis said later. They didn't get along at all, so they stayed with me. Whenever George came to town, Ethel would see him, but on her own, without Bobby. At the last minute, George decided to skip the inauguration swearing-in ceremony altogether. Well, George passed up the official inauguration. he wouldn't have missed the parties, which were right up his alley. Lots of women and lots of booze. During the festivities, Bobby spotted George pawing one of the Hollywood guests, sexy Kim Novak. Furious, he ordered Ethel to put a leash on her lecherous brother. Jim Skakel, who was watching the scene, gleefully recalled. George was giving Kim Novak a kiss, and Ethel stormed over and said, "None of that here! Find someplace else!" Ethel broke it up, and I said to myself, "Holy man, you don't want to bring a good-looking girl to a party around my sister." But Ethel must not have cared too much about philandering, because on their way into town for the parties, Ethel told Jack's boyhood friend Paul Red Fay, just appointed Undersecretary of the Navy, that she had a surprise for him. Fay's wife, Anita, was a close friend of Ethel's, so bear that in mind, and she couldn't be there that night. But Ethel cozied up to him and said, "Now I hope you're going to constantly be thinking of things that you can do for old Eth, because I have really got a prize for you when we get to the gala," Ethel whispered mysteriously to Fay. When they arrived at the party, Ethel pulled him aside. "Before we go up to the box, I got something down here that I want to give to Red." Ethel led him to a tall, shapely blonde draped in fur. "If she'll have you," said Ethel, pointing to Angie Dickinson. "Here's your date for the evening." Ethel then sat back to enjoy the show with Bobby, Jean and Steve Smith, and Angie and Red Fay, who later would often entertain the Kennedys with his rendition of Hooray for Hollywood. In the next box sat the jubilant new president and his glowing first lady. But later that night, according to Peter Lawford, Jack Kennedy had a menage a trois with 2 of 6 Hollywood starlets whom Lawford had arranged for Jack to meet at a party at the home of columnist Joseph Alsop. In the realm of philandering, George Skakel Jr. and Jack Kennedy were like blood brothers. Their womanizing was already well known to insiders, including Ethel. As Bill Whiteford, a longtime Playboy pal of George Skakel's, noted years later, sometimes it seemed that George and the Kennedy brothers were having a contest to see who could screw the most women. For Ethel, Jack's inauguration was another triumph. Even right-leaning New York Journal-American TV columnist Jack O'Brien observed, "Ethel Kennedy is the owner of the most sincerely happy personality this side of Dinah Shore." So it seems to me that Ethel possessed the ability to completely compartmentalize the drama that was going on in her life so that she could just continue to sail through. To be introspective would have not been Ethel Kennedy. I think that with all of the drama and all of the tragedy that went on in her life in its various forms, she just boxed things up and was like, fiddly-dee, I'll think about that tomorrow. I mean, her lack of intellectual honesty on the part of her own personal life is shocking to me. She did not want to think about what had actually happened in her life. She did not want to pursue any line of questioning about, well, if Jack's running around and my brother's running around, is it possible my husband could be running around? He's part of this whole clan. And if she was aware of it, we haven't gotten into that part of the book yet. We'll see. We'll see if she's aware that Bobby's going to turn out to be just like his brother and all of his other siblings. But she just is not at all intellectually curious about what the consequences are of the choices that the people around her are making, and in relation, what choices she's making and you know, how she's being led down the garden path. I find myself so frustrated with her because it just seems like she's so able to cloud her judgment with money and frivolity. And it seems like that's enough for her. That she would do something so appalling as to actively participate in men spending time with women who are not their wives, and actually bring a date for this family friend so that he can like be on the arm of this hot blonde. And she's friends with that guy's wife. It's not like she doesn't know Anita. It's not like she doesn't know Red Fay's wife. And she's just, you know, she's playing a part. She's being the madam, bringing the women. And I'm not saying that anything physically happened there, but like, why did he need this hot date? You know, and it was so sort of salacious the way she did it, you know, just, it wasn't as though they just, you know, sat him next to somebody at dinner so that he'd have somebody to talk to. It's the whole way she seemed to procure this person, and I have a surprise for you, and, you know, make sure that you remember old Eth. I'm just so frustrated with her for participating in this whole scandalous lifestyle and just acting like it's all just fun and games. Like, everything's just so fun for Ethel. Like, ha ha ha, ho ho ho, everything's just fine. She just seems like she's living in this fantasy world in which there are not real consequences. Chapter 56 is entitled Glamour Girl. Over the next 8 years, Ethel would become one of the most flamboyant hostesses Washington had ever seen, supplanting such warhorses as Pearl Mesta and Gwen Carfritz, who had ruled during the Truman and Eisenhower eras. While Jackie tended to draw back from the limelight, Ethel jumped in with both feet, even supplanting Lady Bird Johnson, who, while popular, was not a big draw among Washington's new frontier movers and shakers. Barbara Gamerkian, who had worked in the Kennedy White House press office before becoming a Washington correspondent for the New York Times, said Ethel was a frequent stand-in for Jackie, who sometimes feigned illness to avoid appearances. In one instance, we had a photo shoot set up with a little girl who had some disease, and I had to call Ethel at the last moment because Jackie wanted to play tennis. Then I had to take the photographers on a roundabout route to the girl so that they wouldn't see Jackie on the court. Ethel was a great stand-in, and she loved it. Ordinarily, the Attorney General's wife was considered just another VIP spouse in a city full of them. But Ethel broke all the rules. Simply by being the sister-in-law of the president and carrying the name of Kennedy, Ethel bears a certain ready-made glamour, noted Hearst White House correspondent Marion Means. She attends every event that she can possibly squeeze in. In the first year of her reign, Ethel threw a constant round of parties at Hickory Hill. It would be easy to make Washington's social life a full-time job, she allowed. I like people and parties. She also was involved in dozens of official functions and trips. She was honored by nuns and missionaries for her Christian excellence. She christened the nuclear submarine Polaris, and she traveled with Bobby to the Ivory Coast Republic, where her charm, Life magazine noted, turned out to be a secret weapon of major dimensions. When Ethel heard that the wife of the sub-prefect in the village had 10 children, she quipped, "I'm jealous." In her rare free time, she swam and sailed at Hyannisport, skied near Aspen, and celebrated her 11th wedding anniversary with an outdoor party for 200, where she received a toast from Vice President Johnson, and along with Bobby, Judy Garland, and Kay Thompson, Ethel sang an impromptu rendition of the trolley song. Ethel also rode in a show ring for the first time in a dozen years as a surprise at the Washington International Horse Show. She jumped over 10 fences, toppling a brush and rail obstacle and losing her black bowler hat before an audience of 2,500. Still, Bobby yelled praise to her. "Ethel, you did fine!" She then changed from her riding attire, canary yellow breeches, black boots, and yellow-collared black coat, to a long black velvet sheath topped by a black beaded jacket with a diamond 4-leaf clover in her hair and diamond 3-leaf clover on her lapel. In that event, she presented the first Joseph P. Kennedy Memorial Trophy to the show's winner. Ethel seemed constantly in movement. "I don't know whether energy is a state of mind or whether one is born with it, but I think I was born with it," she explained. All right, let's talk about her fashion, because apparently there was a woman who made all of her clothes, but the woman seems to have been of little consequence, and yet somehow she managed to really worm her way into the upper echelons of Washington society, largely because Ethel took a liking to her. But the thing that is really interesting about Ethel's relationship with this particular dressmaker is that this woman made Ethel all of these knockoff clothes from high-end brands so that Ethel wouldn't have to pay the high-end price, even though she could. And this woman would make her all these look-alike clothes. And they were just enough different that people could tell that they weren't quite the label, but then they were like, but where did this come from? Anyway, this chapter is called The Knockoff Closet. It says, when Swiss-born Mrs. Norman Paul moved to Washington in the mid-1950s with her physician husband, she quickly noted how unfashionably the city's political wives and socialites were dressed. There was, she saw, a wardrobe crisis in the nation's capital. Mrs. Paul was 51 and had studied art but never clothing design. In 1959, she rented a little shop at 1661 Wisconsin Avenue, renamed herself Madame Paul, and had little gold cards printed up, hired an assistant from the Dominican Republic who spoke little English, and opened up for business. Not long after, Jackie Kennedy, window shopping a few blocks from her home on North Street, strolled in. The de Gaulles were visiting Washington, and Jackie needed a hat for the occasion. She spoke to Madame Paul about her needs, and left explicit instructions written in pencil on pink paper, requesting that she make a copy of a certain hat using the same material as the original. Madame Paul, who specialized only in dresses, had her seamstress whip up a hat that pleased Jackie. Maybe you can do something with Ethel, she told the dressmaker. Ethel, who had been buying off the rack at Saks and Bonwitz, was soon making regular weekly shops at Madame Paul's, usually accompanied by Sarah Davis. Sarah was a very good influence on Ethel, observed Madame Paul. She had very good taste. Ethel became such a regular at the shop that she showed up one day with her own personal coffee pot. Ethel brought other Kennedy women to Madame Paul. Joan, Eunice, Jean, even Rose, and many friends, including journalist Anne Chamberlain, a Time Life reporter, who soon wrote a glowing profile of the designer in Ladies' Home Journal headlined, "She Dresses the Lady Pioneers of the New Frontier," which made Madame Paul famous overnight. Soon items about Ethel and her dressmaker began appearing in leading fashion journals. Referring to a 3-week South American trip Ethel had planned with Bobby, Women's Wear Daily noted, "Mrs. Kennedy has packed lots of dresses, suits, and coats for Madame Paul." Above the item was a sketch of Ethel looking like a Barbie doll cutout, labeled "Ethel in the Pink." The sketch had Ethel wearing one of Madame Paul's designs, a side-buttoned and stitched low-belted pink sharkskin coat dress. "Watch Ethel emerge as America's goodwill ambassadress," the paper predicted cutely. Another time, Women's Wear Daily called Ethel the all-American girl, noting that in her closet were items from Oscar de la Renta, Dior, and Molly Parnis. "She buys good American clothes and wears them well with innate breeding and good taste," the trade paper gushed. But to Ethel's chagrin, it was always Jackie who made the best-dressed lists, who was elected First Lady of Fashion, who was never photographed wearing the same outfit twice, and who was now spending over $40,000 a year on clothing. Let's do the math, friends. Help me out with that. $40,000 in 1960 is a king's ransom. What in the world? Whose money was she spending? $40,000, probably Joe Kennedy, since he told her that if she would stay, he would make sure that she could spend how much she wanted on clothes. Unlike some of the other women who had descended on Madame Paul, she personally liked Ethel because she didn't act snobby and was willing to take fashion advice. People said Ethel didn't have the best taste in terms of fashion, Madame Paul said years later. Ethel liked green because she loved trees, but that color didn't look good on her, and I turned her toward pinks and reds, which were becoming. Madame Paul found Ethel the perfect customer because she had simple tastes and a good figure. She had a very strong little body with little breasts and an athletic body like a young boy's. She was not frilly. "Don't put any ruffles on it," she always told me. She liked classic clothes, like those from Chanel. Many times Ethel saw a dress in a shop or a magazine that she liked, but she didn't want to pay extraordinary prices for it, so she'd tell me, "Madame Paul, why don't you make me a copy?" I didn't do exactly the same, but something similar. Every year Madame Paul flew to Europe for the Paris and Italian shows. Before one of her trips, Ethel sent her flowers from Park Avenue florist Irene Hayes, Wadley, and Smith. Attached was a short note asking her to make copies of the latest from top designers. She also requested, tongue-in-cheek, that she bring back a Frenchman for her. Women's Page reporters, keeping an eagle eye on Ethel, soon caught on to her game. A sharp reporter noted that Ethel had arrived at a function in what looked at first glance to be a Chanel suit, piped in gold braid with gold buttons. But no one else in the world has one just like it. She doesn't have to worry about the 7th Avenue in New York copying it, or someone else copying the copy, or copying the copy of the copy. Her own Madame Paul did it locally. Ethel drooled over Madame Paul's well-made, inexpensive, and authentic-looking knockoffs, but she also bought originals at wholesale whenever she could. Ethel's modus operandi was simple. She'd go into a store like Saks and try on an expensive designer dress that she liked, a friend said, but if it looked good on her, she'd give the salesperson an excuse for not buying it. But she'd get the style number off the ticket, and she'd then call a broker in New York, who'd get it for her at cost plus 10%. She felt you were a fool if you bought direct at clothing retail. In some cases, Ethel got dresses directly from designers. She became a good friend of Oleg Cassini, Jackie's official designer as First Lady, and others who would work with her price-wise. When Ethel's schedule became impossibly full, Madame Paul often made special trips to Hickory Hill to discuss designs and fabrics and do fittings. Often, a Hickory Hill secretary telephoned Ethel's itinerary to Madame Paul, who'd recommend what she should wear and then make it. A yellow shantung suit for a breakfast with the First Lady at the Sheridan Park Hotel, a raspberry silk suit for a White House diplomatic reception, a hot pink and white print afternoon dress for a benefit at Hickory Hill. Ethel's closets quickly filled with Madame Paul's designs. Finally, she devoted one large closet exclusively to her favorite dressmaker and even put a sign on the door with Madame Paul's name on it. In just a few years, Ethel had bought more than 100 outfits from her. Unlike her sister-in-law, Jackie, who would sell her used clothing on consignment at a chic thrift shop in New York, Ethel held on to her things. Said Madame Paul, "When I visited Ethel, I'd say many times, 'Ooh, you still have this dress and that dress,' and she'd say, 'Yes, I still wear that.' Some she wore many, many times. She kept her clothes a long time. I never asked her, but I don't think she ever donated any of her clothes to charity." Ethel, known to be tough on people who worked for her, treated Madame Paul with kid gloves, even though one member of the circle said she made that little woman sew her fingers to the bone and then try to get it for free. With Bobby running the Justice Department, Ethel had no qualms about using Jack's position as president to help her pals. Once, when Madame Paul complained of a backache, Ethel telephoned the White House and got Jackie on the phone. "I wonder if Dr. Travel is around." Dr. Travel was Jack's personal physician and the one who helped him with all his back pain. "Ethel," Madame Paul recalled, "immediately took me to the White House. Dr. Travel did a very good job because in the next few days I was already on my feet. I think she gave me a shot in the spine." Ethel regularly sent Madame Paul invitations to official Kennedy functions that others would die to attend. Madame Paul also was on Ethel's VIP Christmas card list and the recipient of cute thank you notes. In one, Ethel said that a new white fur ski hat she'd purchased conveniently hid her hair and made people look at her head instead of her feet, which were always in motion. When Ethel traveled with Bobby to Greece in 1962 as part of a world tour, she sent back a black and white picture postcard showing a peasant woman riding on a donkey with all her worldly possessions aboard. Ethel warned that this is what would happen to Greek couturiers who sold a design to one special customer and then knocked off copies for her friends. Okay. That was slightly interesting. Let's read about this chapter called Handmaidens. What might that be about, you ask yourself? Well, Handmaidens is about all the women that she collected around herself, who she expected to do favors for her and just out of the kindness of their own heart. That her being a Kennedy meant that they should want to be around her, and that she was being generous to allow them in her circle. Okay, Ethel, we're becoming a dislikable person day by day. Ethel had become a fashion trendsetter with her tanned legs, chic little dresses, simple gold jewelry, and short white cotton gloves that she donned even if it was 95 degrees. Washington insider and journalist Barbara Hauer, a friend of Ethel's during the Kennedy and Johnson years, observed, "It was fun merely to watch everyone dashing about frenetically, ordering from Ethel's seamstress those sleeveless little gabardine dresses in the right shade of pink at just the right height above the knees, placing multi-jeweled pins at the exact same spot on the chest. The women of Washington, myself included, trying to garb themselves exactly in what eventually became a national craze for women to have the Kennedy look. Women also started redecorating their homes in breezy Ethel Kennedy fabrics. PYG is what I called them, pink, yellow, and green people," said Hauer. Ew. Y'all, let's not go there. Let's not do our homes in pink, yellow, and green. Some Washington women even had babies at the same time she did, using the same obstetrician and hospital, something that required true planning, even though Ethel gave everyone ample opportunity to follow her example, Hauer noted. There was a small group of women around Ethel who was dubbed the SS Girls because their first or last names began with the letters S and because they protected and defended their territory, namely Ethel, as fiercely as the elite German SS troops of the Third Reich had guarded their Fuhrer. Besides Sarah Davis, there was Sue Markham, wife of Bobby's pal Dean Markham, who worked at the White House and later for Great Lakes Carbon. Sue Wilson, wife of Donald Wilson, appointed by Jack to be deputy director of the U.S. Information Agency. And Liz Stevens, wife of television producer George Stevens, among others. Like Ethel, they were all bright-eyed and perky and so energetic it seemed as if each of them took an equal dose of speed in the morning, said one observer. They rode shotgun around Ethel, jealously guarding their territory. They were Ethel's groupies, her handmaidens, the palace guard wearing the same Madame Paul dresses, Roger Vivier shoes with the gold buckle and bouffant flip. Each had different responsibilities. Astronaut Scott Carpenter's wife, Renee, doubled as a traveling companion and hairdresser for Ethel. Liz Stevens was in charge of the children and functioned as a loving aunt. Kay Evans, the wife of columnist Roland Evans, oversaw the smooth operation of Hickory Hill when Ethel traveled. These women became celebrities of sorts themselves, getting their names and pictures in the paper when they appeared at an event with their leader. Sarah Davis, for example, got a mention in the Washington Post when, at a social event, she had to scurry around to find an appropriate pair of shoes for Ethel, who had left hers at home. How do you go to an event and leave your shoes at home? I mean, I know that Ethel's life is chaotic, but it seems like the shoes would make it. Later, looking back at this period, Sarah Davis observed that, quote, "It was a very exciting atmosphere, beautiful lunches, interesting guests, and Ethel was always very funny. It was bizarre, but it worked for those women because that's what they wanted, to be part of the inner circle," said Barbara Hauer. "It was all part of the Kennedy mystique. There were people in Washington who would fall on swords for her," said Hauer. "The real truth is that Ethel was a user, a big user. She knew what she wanted from you, and she would give something back, and that would be an invitation to Hickory Hill. To Ethel, Hickory Hill was her fiefdom. She was the queen, and many of those around her were jesters in her court. One of them was Dean Markham. During a trip to Europe, Ethel had met one of the famous matadors, Manuel Benitez, known as El Cordobas. He was the idol of the jet set, and when he told her he was planning a visit to the United States, she promptly invited him to come see her and Bobby at Hickory Hill. Ethel planned a big dinner party in his honor, but it snowed, and he canceled. Ethel was miffed. Dean Markham, seeing her agitation, went out and returned a short time later dressed in a matador's outfit that he'd rented. Dean was a wonderful, adorable person who loved Ethel and Bobby, said an insider. But he felt pressure to do things like that quite often, things that he probably would have just as soon not have done, because they made him look foolish. Yeah, what a stupid thing to do. If the matador can't make it, you are not compelled to go out and put on a costume. Like, if you don't want to be the court jester, don't put yourself in that position. Did somebody put a knife to your throat and say, "Get on the costume"? One of those who desperately wanted to get in the inner circle was the wife of the head of one of the regulatory agencies in the Kennedy administration, who was always asking Ethel's pals, "What can I do? What do you need?" When she finally got her chance, one of the handmaidens asked her to pick up a dozen pair of black stockings for Ethel. The anxious woman made the fatal mistake of putting a signed note in the box to get Ethel's attention, which meant that Ethel would now have to take the time to send a thank you note. Ethel didn't have time to deal with that sort of thing, said a member of the old inner circle years later. The girls all went crazy and closed that woman out after that. How dare she put her name on a note card in the box of a dozen black stockings? How dare she try to get Ethel's attention? Shut her out, cut. Once at the annual pet show that Ethel threw for charity at Hickory Hill, Barbara Hauer received a nasty kick from a pony and had to be rushed to a hospital in an ambulance. A few days later, a dozen China roses arrived at Hauer's with a note from Ethel saying how sorry she was about what had happened. What was interesting was that at the bottom of the note, Ethel wrote, "Don't respond to this." What she was saying was, "We're not going to be chummy over this. Here are the flowers. Click." Of all the Kennedy women, Ethel had the most arrogance and considered herself the truest Kennedy. But how can you be the truest Kennedy when you aren't one? You know, you're just play acting, sad little girl. I feel particularly annoyed with this chapter. As I said at the beginning, Ethel to me has just been of no consequence. She's just sort of a fly-by-night, flighty, unserious person. And I think she's still all those things, but now she's mean on top of it, which makes it worse. You know, if you're just this sort of unthoughtful person, but you're not really harming anybody, okay, you know, it's unfortunate you can't give more to the world, but whatever. But now you're unthoughtful and mean? We have problems now. Okay, this chapter is called Bay of Pigs. The Kennedy brothers landed on their feet running. At Justice, Bobby pledged to continue his war on labor corruption and organized crime. He'd even put together a hit list of mafioso targeted for prosecution. At the White House, Jack increased the U.S. presence in Southeast Asia by sending advisors to help train the Laotian army. He also promised to play catch-up after the Soviet Union took the lead in the space race by sending Major Yuri Gagarin into orbit in a Sputnik named Vostok. All of that was public, but behind closed doors, from his first day in office, Jack had been involved in a top-secret plan to overthrow Cuba's communist leader Fidel Castro. The operation involved an invasion of Cuba by anti-Castro exiles at the Bay of Pigs. A few weeks before the April 1961 assault, Jack brought Bobby in on the plans. He had delayed notifying him because information about the operation was on a need-to-know basis, and Jack knew Bobby was busy putting together his team at Justice, so he just kept him out of the loop until the last minute, a decision Jack would come to regret when the invasion failed. Bobby, Jack came to believe, could have offered valuable advice and counsel. Yeah, seems like maybe just don't muck around in that kind of thing. Do you need counsel to tell you not to do that kind of thing? Even Jack's trusted appointee at Navy, Red Fay, hadn't been told. The night before the Cuban Patriots were scheduled to land, Red and his wife, Anita, were eating hamburgers and hot dogs at Hickory Hill when Bobby revealed the invasion plan. Fay was humiliated and angry at Jack for not having briefed him. Intensely anti-communist, Ethel was particularly scornful of Castro. For years, the Skakel family had had a long and happy history in Cuba under the Batista dictatorship. Great Lakes Carbon had maintained an office in Havana. The company sold filters using Cuba's sugar industry, and the Skakels had close friends there. Ethel was concerned for their safety. She prayed that Castro's regime would be overturned at whatever cost. After George Skakel Sr.'s death, some of his children continued visiting the island despite the political dangers. George Skakel Jr., for one, often went there to hunt for quail on a preserve situated on a penal colony off the mainland, or to go after wild boar in the Cuban bush. His frequent companion on these trips was Lewis Warner II, the Midwestern bureau chief of the Central Intelligence Agency, who used a position in the post office as a cover for his clandestine activities. Because of the sensitive business and social contacts that the Skakels maintained in Cuba, George was often able to supply the CIA, through Werner, with valuable intelligence information about Castro's activities, the country's sugar production, and other such data, some of which was used plotting the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. Jim Skakel later confirmed that Great Lakes Carbon, which had offices worldwide, routinely supplied intelligence information to the CIA and other U.S. government intelligence agencies. Well, that is a crossover I had not anticipated. I guess I should have anticipated it. But that the Skakels and the Kennedys would have anything to do with each other on this level is just like, these people were just running the world, weren't they? How are the crazy people of Lake Avenue, that complete and total circus atmosphere of a home, the ones running the world? It's a scary place we live in, you guys. May the Lord come back. The day Castro took over, George Skakel Jr. was vacationing in Cuba with Werner, another friend, Don Tace, and their wives, when they were confronted by a band of armed soldiers who demanded their customized 42-foot Chris Craft, the Virginia, owned by Jim Skakel and named after his wife. The revolutionaries had seen the high-speed boat in action and wanted it then and there. They were pointing Tommy guns at us, and I must say I was a little nervous, recalled Tace later. But George Skakel told them, "Go to hell! We're going fishing." And that's exactly what we did. They looked dumbfounded. Well, at least George's hubris has come to some use. Afterward, Jim Skakel, who also was in Cuba at the time, got a call from the other side, a CIA agent who wanted to borrow the boat for clandestine operations. Jim agreed, and the craft subsequently was used to take 157 people safely off the island. Back in Florida, the CIA held on to the craft, arming it with machine gun mounts and new engines. After making numerous calls to get his boat back, Jim gave up and never saw the Virginia again. "I figured they were in enough trouble without me going after the damn boat," he said later. What? I mean, you guys, I don't feel like I am adequately conveying to you my shock. I didn't read this far ahead. And I had no idea that the Skakels were so wrapped up in this whole Bay of Pigs foolishness. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Jack assigned Bobby, CIA Director Alan Dulles, and others to investigate why U.S. intelligence experts had underestimated Cuba's power to crush the invasion. Bobby found some comfort in the fact that at least one of the Skakels had suffered. When Bobby heard what had happened to Jim's boat, he gloated, recalled George Terrian. Bobby told Georgianne, "The Bay of Pigs was all worth it just to nail one of your brothers." Okay. What is Bobby's animus with these people? I mean, is it because they're richer than him? Is it because they can spend without care or concern? Does he envy the freedom that they have to do whatever they want without really caring what the consequences are? Because, well, Bobby isn't quite there yet, I don't think. I think that he is still hanging on to this idea that he's supposed to behave in a certain way, and he's agitated and annoyed that her family doesn't do it. But I think that if he could act like that and get away with it and not feel anything in his conscience or not be caught, I think he'd be acting just like them. Meanwhile, Ethel played her own role in the Cold War when, in the winter of 1962, she was quietly recruited as figurehead for a program to compete with the Soviets for the hearts and minds of some 5,000 foreigners in Washington who formed part of the International Diplomatic Corps. The idea was to wine and dine and entertain them like the Russians had been doing. Pedro San Juan, deputy to the chief of protocol at the State Department, recommended Ethel as the front of the operation. "Very few people are the embodiment of the optimism and the contagious enthusiasm of the new frontier that Mrs. Robert F. Kennedy is," he wrote in a memo. "Therefore, we would like to ask her to be our honorary sponsor. This will not take any of her time unless she desires to take part in these arrangements." But Ethel was thrilled. All right, this next chapter is called Hickory Hill Comes to Justice. Well, Bobby had surrounded himself with many highly competent associates from his rackets committee days and from Jack's campaign team. He was still a hands-on attorney general. He had started putting in 12-hour days and 6-day weeks, going home to Hickory Hill for dinner and then returning to the Justice Department until close to midnight. As a result, Ethel and Bobby were spending less time together. Since July 1951, when her first baby was born, Ethel had been pregnant an average of once every 15 months. She had had babies in 1951, 1952, 1954, 1955, 1956, 1958, and 1959. But in the period between the beginning and the end of Camelot, a span of about 28 months, Ethel would have only one baby. Because work was occupying so much of his time, Bobby and Ethel began bringing some of Hickory Hill to the Justice Department. For a time, Bobby was chauffeured to work each day with his favorite pet, a 14-month-old sad-eyed black Newfoundland puppy, Brumus, who was constantly at the Attorney General's side, even during the filming by the U.S. Information Agency of a visit to the Attorney General's office by a group of Brazilian students. As the cameras whirled, Bobby solemnly poured the dog a drink of water from a silver pitcher into an ashtray to the delight of his guests. But FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover began raising questions about the propriety of a pooch in the hallowed halls of justice. An obsessive bureaucrat did some quick research and discovered that there was a law banning all but seeing eye dogs from public buildings. Now facing a maximum fine of 30 days in jail and $50, the Attorney General of the United States decided to leave Brumus at home. Bobby also caused consternation when he started tossing the pigskin around his office with his deputy, former All-American football star, Byron Whizzer White. "One of these days," grumbled an aide, "it's going to go out the window." When White had to drop out of the sessions, Ethel drove 3 of the children in to play with their father, once in front of a startled visitor from Great Britain. On one occasion, Ethel convinced Bobby to have a midwinter cookout in the Attorney General's office, using the fireplace to grill hamburgers and hot dogs. When Bill Gogian, an assistant attorney general, questioned the decorum and suggested that pre-cooked chicken might be more appropriate, Bobby wrote him a memo. "You're getting old and crotchety. We will not get to the moon first with this attitude." I do not think that cooking hamburgers and hot dogs in the fireplace is how you get to the moon, but okay, Bobby. Late one afternoon, Bobby was changing clothes in his office to attend a formal dinner when Ethel appeared with all 7 children. Out of control, they started pushing intercom buttons, going through files, and galloping up and down the halls, yelling and listening for their echoes. FBI agents swarmed in when they pushed a button under Hoover's desk. The tumult finally ended when Ethel and a nursemaid rounded up the herd and carted them back to Hickory Hill. Like her mother and father, Ethel had a laissez-faire attitude with her own children. "I just don't believe a child's words should be entirely full of don'ts. We think it's possible to have discipline and still give the children independence without spoiling them," she said. Okay, Ethel, if that's what you want to say. See, like that's always the line of the parent who doesn't really want to do their job. I don't believe in always saying no. Well, do you believe in ever saying no? Because how in the world are you going to show up at the FBI building and let the kids just run rampant, pushing buttons and going through files and screaming up and down the halls? Okay, one more chapter, and this chapter is called Everybody into the Pool. What's that mean? Social life at Hickory Hill became more like Lake Avenue. Yes, I love Lake Avenue. But now, instead of cars being driven into the water by spoiled children, the best and the brightest of Camelot were being tossed into the drink fully clothed. Ethel's people-dunking parties became infamous overnight, like the goldfish swallowing and the telephone booth stuffing stunts of college sophomores. While Ethel thought it was hilarious to see serious types such as presidential advisor Arthur Schlesinger Jr. soaked to the skin, others viewed the activity as boorish, foolhardy, and an embarrassment to the administration. One who held that view was Schlesinger's then-wife, Marion Schlesinger, a writer who observed years later that Ethel was childish and self-indulgent. She created a certain atmosphere of fun and games, as it were, and everything was done on a lavish scale. It was like a great big party all the time, extravagant and excessive. It's just too much of everything. Everyone was attracted to Ethel, but that was because of Bob's P-O-W-E-R. Arthur Schlesinger, on the other hand, viewed Ethel as the best thing that ever happened to Bobby. Her jokes diverted him. Her social gifts offset his abiding shyness. Her inextinguishable gaiety lightened his times of moodiness and pessimism. Her passion moved him. When he married Ethel, he blossomed. Either way, the swimming pool hijinks made Ethel the best-known party giver in America, which, to her, was quite a distinction. To men around Ethel, Bobby's aides and advisors, the ritualistic dunkings became a mark of initiation into a very exclusive club, branding them as genuine Kennedy insiders. Those who didn't get tossed into the water felt left out, like Senator Kenneth Keating of New York, expressing disappointment. In a tongue-in-cheek Dear Ethel letter, the distinguished senator wrote, "I was delighted to read in the Herald Tribune that your party went off so swimmingly, which compounds my woes in not having been able to be on hand in my Hickory Hill formal attire, black tie and bikini. I hope the mad rumor isn't true. But you're changing the name of Hickory Hill to Drip Dry Manor. Best wishes to you and the General, and please don't leave me out of your next party." Even that era's stolid, gray New York Times seriously reported Arthur Schlesinger's first dunking, which occurred during a garden party and dinner dance for some 300 guests that Ethel and Bobby had given for the Peter Lawfords. A source close to the family said Mrs. Kennedy, in evening attire, plunged into the water after a leg of a chair slipped off a plank placed across the pool's edges. The same thing happened to Mr. Schlesinger and Mrs. Sarah Davis. All three changed clothes and returned to the party, but another guest, Lieutenant Colonel John H. Glenn, Jr., kept his chair upright, although its legs were but 3 inches from the edge of the plank, said the United Press International Dispatch the Times ran. U.S. News and World Report devoted a whole page to Fun on the New Frontier. Who fell? Who was pushed? The story even included an aerial photograph of the Kennedys' pool. Washington Evening Star Society reporter Betty Beale, who broke the pool dunking story, concluded that John Glenn bears a charmed life. Ethel Kennedy likes to live dangerously, and poolsmanship is an integral part of Hickory Hill. After the party, Ethel, with a wink, suggested that it was she who shoved Schlesinger. Later, Lea Udall, wife of Interior Secretary Stuart Udall, claimed responsibility. "All these years, Ethel's been taking the rap for me," she said. "I was dancing by, and he was standing there holding forth, being so Arthurish, and something came over me. I just stuck out my arm and pushed him and danced away. He never knew." Gerald Tremblay, Bobby's pal from law school, who was a frequent houseguest at Hickory Hill during those days, and was present when the first dunking happened, noted that while Ethel enjoyed the stunt, Bobby didn't. "They were kind of acting wild, and Sarah Davis, who was a good-looking gal, got thrown in the pool wearing a dress," Tremblay recalled. "She came out of the water and thought it would be kind of wild to jump into Bobby's arms all wet, and she did, and he got really ticked off." Davis later denied that the incident with Bobby ever took place. While men like Schlesinger were avid fans of Ethel and her style, some of their wives, like Marion Schlesinger, were less than enamored. In that category was Violet Marshall, wife of Burke Marshall, one of Bobby's most trusted and respected aides at Justice. "She was not the sort of person I could discuss gardening with or what I had just read unless it was some really sensationalistic book," Violet Marshall said years later. Ethel also comes at you in kind of a gushy way. I suppose it's insincerity, because how can anybody know and like that many people? It's a social mannerism that she has. It's an act. She'd point to somebody who was in the gathering and tell you what that person had just done and what he was known for and what he just said and wasn't that a clever thing to say? That sort of thing. Gossip. And I was supposed to feel flattered by that. With the passage of time, Violet Marshall also came to the realization that Ethel could, at times, be mean-spirited and rude. She felt the sting of Ethel's wrath one summer day at Hyannisport. As soon as the Marshalls had arrived, Ethel jumped on Violet to join in the mixed doubles match. Violet, who had agreed to the visit under duress from my husband, who was Bobby's closest confidant, had not come prepared for tennis. She was wearing colorful shorts rather than tennis whites and didn't have her racket. Before Violet could raise a winning argument, she was out on the court teamed with Edwin Guthman, Bobby's press secretary at Justice. The two-set match didn't turn out the way Ethel had hoped. Though Ethel is a better tennis player than I, and she thought she was, and in fact she knew she was, somehow we managed to win, Violet Marshall said. After the match, the players shook hands, but Ethel didn't seem very happy. As she once said, "I like competition, but I like to win better." Everyone returned to the house to prepare for dinner, which was equally as unpleasant and embarrassing, because Joan Kennedy, who was intoxicated, used the occasion to tell Violet Marshall and anyone else in earshot that her marriage to Ted, who also was at the table, was in trouble. With everyone seated at the table and with all kinds of currents and cross-currents going on, Ethel suddenly glared at Violet Marshall and in fury bellowed, "Never, never, ever wear yellow shorts on my tennis court!" I was completely crushed. To say I lost my appetite is putting it mildly, she recalled. I was so hurt because it was all so unexpected. I had seen Ethel hurt other people in the past with little barbs here and there, but I never expected that. It was mean-spirited. My partner in tennis said, "Talk about sore losers." On the way home, Burke Marshall attempted to pacify his shaken wife. Well, he said, that's Ethel. After the incident at the Cape, Violet Marshall made a pledge to herself. I'll never in my life play tennis again with Ethel Kennedy. Oh, of all the problems one could have. Yes. Mark that off. Don't play tennis with Ethel. But that would have been embarrassing if you would come unprepared, then somebody pushed you to play and then mocked you for not having the right clothes on and acting like it was this major faux pas. I mean, how lame. Okay. I have read for almost an hour and 10 minutes to make up for that sad, sad little episode before. But as you all know, time's taken. We got to get on with the day. But thank you so much for hanging out with me. And I will see you guys later. And I so appreciate that you guys are loving this book with me. All of your comments are so helpful and lovely. And it's just fun when you've picked a book and everyone's enjoying it. It's a lot of fun. So thank you so much for completing my joy by enjoying the book with me. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.